Ah, yes, the Middle Ages, a time of valiant knights, majestic castles, and rampant plagues. But even if you survived the Black Death, you might not have survived school. That's right. Then you had a chance to go to school. Not a guarantee, but a chance. Boys, because girls weren't allowed to go to school, not even to learn Latin, which really makes you wonder what the point of all that praying was if you could uneven pray with half the population. Your writing implement was a quill, basically a fancy feather, and if you made a mistake, you couldn't erase it. So if you got tired of staring at the wall, you could always stare at the window and imagine you were looking out of it. Or maybe that was just a trick they played on you to keep you from screaming, "I'm bored." Who knows? All we know is that if you did scream, "I'm bored," you got a spanking. There was no such thing as a rubber eraser. And the only thing keeping you from getting whipped was your thick skull, so count yourself lucky. You never went to medieval school. Instead, you had to tear out the parchment and start over. A time of gallant knights, majestic castles, and rampant plagues. But even if you survived the Black Death, you might not have survived school. That's right. Going to school in the Middle Ages was a fate worse than death. And if you ran out of parchment, well, you just had to hope your teacher didn't notice your little slip-up. Going to school in the Middle Ages was a fate worse than death. At least death was quick. They tried to cram your brain full of facts. The main subject was, you guessed it, Latin, because if God could speak Latin, then surely he wanted his disciples to speak Latin too, preferably while weeping softly. Other subjects included theology, or the study of God and his many rules, and philosophy, which was mostly about arguing with Greek philosophers who had been dead for centuries. School was excruciatingly slow. You had to sit at your desk for hours every day and listen to the monk droning on. If you were a naughty boy, you got a spanking. Simple as that. The only thing separating medieval school from a first world country is that they used parchment instead of paper. Parchment, by the way, was made from animal skins, which may explain why the pages sometimes had holes in them. First of all, you had to be lucky enough to get in. See, during the Middle Ages, most people couldn't read or write. That was just how it was. Illiteracy was so widespread that when someone could read, they were considered pretty smart. They were also pretty lucky, because that meant they probably were and going to die trying to read the scroll telling them. They had to pay their overlord 372 lashes. But if you were one of the select few who could read Latin, the language of the scholarly elite, if you were a poor boy who managed to get into school, your life was still pretty rough. You would live with the other students in a dormitory, and your only bed was a straw pallet. But if you were a rich boy whose parents could afford to send you to a private school run by a wealthy monastery, then sweet dreams are made of this. Just kidding, it was still awful. The teachers, or monks, believed that the best way to learn was to memorize things by heart. So instead of teaching you how to think and to learn all these fascinating topics, and you wouldn't be able to sharpen your pencil to make writing easier. In fact, you didn't even have a pencil. The worst part was that the only light in your schoolhouse came from the single window. So yes, medieval school was not only incredibly boring, but also dangerous. You could get whipped just for having bad handwriting. Hey, don't forget to stay tuned and watch another video. Ah yes, the Middle Ages. Welcome to my channel. Here's one fact about life in a medieval schoolhouse that you won't learn anywhere else. Picture a classroom. Now remove the chairs. Got it? Okay, remove the heating. Okay, now remove the windows. And let's take out all the air and all the happiness too. That's your medieval learning zone. Yep, every kid in the class would be required to sing in Latin. Off key, out of tune, doesn't matter. Others were more interested in rote memorization and making sure those pupils knew their place. You might be rewarded with an hour of free time. This would usually be spent playing a game like chess or tag, or you might read something secular like a story about a knight or a princess. Many teachers were monks, and they believed that joy was a sin and should have no part in the classroom. Imagine spending 6 days, a week in a room with boys who had been bathed in days under the cold glare of a man who thought joy was a sin. Yeah, it was pretty miserable. No wonder there were so many rebellions. The goal was to praise God, and to do that, you had to sing. You sat on a wooden bench, no desk, hunched over an animal skin parchment, using a scratchy quill. Then it was back to the books. Well, it depended on whether you were a boy or a girl, how much money your family had, and how much your teacher liked you. They got to play outside at recess and they didn't have to wear uniforms. And while their teachers were often strict, they were also very smart. After all, they had to memorize everything they taught. But one thing was for sure, it was very different from today. For one thing, it was a lot less comfortable. No desks, no chairs, just a big hall with rows upon rows of benches. And instead of textbooks, students used a slate and a pencil, or they shared a book. And instead of an iPad or a computer, they had a quill and some parchment. It was hot in the summer and freezing in the winter, and instead of pizza and Pop-Tarts, they ate stale bread. Afternoons were spent much like mornings were, with the occasional interruption from a visiting dignitary or a particularly vicious fight amongst the students. When the bell rang at 3 p.m., it was time to go. Students would file out of the schoolhouse and head home, usually on foot, sometimes with a staff, carrying their books and their quills, dreaming of a time when they could finally use their education to change the world. Or maybe they just wanted a nice bath, dipped in ink that smudged if you so much as breathed. There were no books for each student. If you were lucky, there was one book for the whole class, and it was probably chained to the wall. It wasn't exactly an ideal situation for eager young minds, but it was certainly an improvement over the chaos of the homeschooling that came before it. What would a typical day at school be like? Well, first you'd have to get there. If you lived close enough to the school, great. If not, you might have to walk miles, sometimes barefoot, making sure to arrive before the bell rang. Otherwise, you'd be late and your teacher would be none too pleased. Just like today, really. Except today, if you're late, you might just get detention. In the Middle Ages, you might get a good thrashing. So you'd want to make sure you weren't late. Once you arrived, you'd doff your hat and kneel down for a prayer. Then it was time for morning song. Then came the 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic. Reading was usually done aloud with the class, taking turns reading parts of a text, usually something religious. Writing involved copying down passages from a book, painstakingly recreating the script, and arithmetic consisted of memorizing multiplication tables and doing sums. After that, it was on to the other subjects, which would include some science, logic, rhetoric, grammar, and geometry. Boys would also learn some music theory, while the girls concentrated more on domestic skills. The subjects were taught in Latin, and while some teachers did their best to impart knowledge to their pupils, if you survived the week without getting beaten or going blind from inhaling too much chalk, lunch was a quiet affair, eaten in silence while sitting on the floor. So, what was education like in the Middle Ages? But it wasn't all bad. School? Those sweet memories of sitting at your desk daydreaming about what you were gonna do when you grow up. Being a student in the Middle Ages, you would memorize the words to the S, the PELLINGBOOK too. The very definition of rote learning, which I guess is better than getting your ass kicked, except in cases where God didn't care all that much either. And sure, you could always try to hide under your desk and eat lunch, but then again, you'd probably get in even more trouble for that. So nope, you wouldn't last a day in medieval school. Sorry, but you can't spell SCH double hockey sticks OLARMANDERSKY, but why? Why would they do this? Well, because back in the medieval age, books were super precious, expensive items. So, if you had the privilege of owning a book, you couldn't exactly go around highlighting passages and writing notes in the margins. That would ruin its value. So, instead of taking notes, medieval students would commit the entire text to memory, sometimes reciting the works out loud until they knew them by heart. This is actually how most people in the Middle Ages learned, by memorizing things. Priests would memorize entire prayers. Jurists would memorize laws and regulations. Even nobles would hire tutors to help them memorize the proper etiquette for different social situations. If you wanted to be taken seriously in medieval society, you needed to have a good memory. Oh boy, no, you wouldn't survive a day in those hallowed halls of medieval learning. Not unless you possessed one very special skill, the ability to memorize everything you read. Because unlike today where you can look up stuff on the internet or, God forbid, use your own brain to come up with a passing understanding of the subject at hand, Medieval students had to literally memorize every single word from the books they read, down to the grammatical articles and declensions. Writing down every word from the board because you ain't want to get in trouble for not participating. Eating lunch under your desk while listening to all the other kids in your grade, arguing about how they never gone na amount to anything. And you confidently answered, Paris, but then panicked because you couldn't remember if it was Paris or Paris. Well, that would have been a disaster because making a mistake during a recitation was kind of a big deal. I mean, usually it would just result in extra credit, but occasionally it could get you killed. Medieval students were often punished physically for making mistakes. Depending on the severity of the offense, a naughty student might receive a sharp rap on the knuckles with a ruler or, get their ear pulled so hard that it nearly tore off. And those were the light punishments. Professors had nearly complete control over their students and would often beat them with a rod or whip. In more extreme cases, a particularly nasty professor could order a student's expulsion from the university and ban them from the city. Usually, though, the threat of physical punishment was enough to keep students on their toes. After all, it's hard to daydream when you're worried you're going to get your butt kicked. Yeah, those were the good old days. But you know what wasn't like the good old days? And no, this wasn't just for the big important books of theology and philosophy. So imagine the surprise when a professor asked, "What is the capital of France?" Of course, there was always the option of praying to God that your professor would show mercy. Think your school was strict? Yeah, me too. But it can get way worse, like medieval levels of bad. In the 1800s, a teacher named John Tillard wrote a book called The Discipline of the School. And it's basically a manual for all the worst things teachers did back then. And let me tell you, it ain't pretty. And I mean an actual physical beating with rods, canes, or belts. So you do want to be a class clown because one wrong move and you get the strap, talking in class. Whack. As a teacher, Healer was the king of humiliation. He'd make you wear a dunce cap back then. If you were poor, your options were limited. You either took whatever job you could get, or you followed your passion and became a monk, nun, priest, or minister. If you were a girl, your options were even more limited. You were basically expected to get married and have babies. Your main goal in life was to find a rich guy who wouldn't mind marrying you. And if you were a person of color, you had the same opportunities as everyone else. Just kidding. You got none. Stand in a corner and even force you to stay after school to clean the toilets. And if that wasn't enough, now, instead of burning witches, we send them to college. At least you didn't get the strap. Now, instead of flogging students, we give them pop quizzes. Now, instead of working 12 hours a day in a factory, you only have to work 8 hours a day in an office. Now, instead of getting married at 14, you only have to wait until you're 18. And now, instead of being a servant for life, you can become president. Well, maybe not that last one. Like the pressure to succeed. Back then, it was all about rote memorization and obedience. And if you couldn't keep up, well, you were just stupid. Today, we value creativity and critical thinking, but we still punish kids for not fitting in. Healer made you recite your mistakes in front of the whole class. Like imagine reading, "I will not talk in class," while everyone stares at you. Talk about an awkward silence. Yawning, whack, falling asleep. Whack, double whack, triple whack. Even asking a question could get you a whack, the logic. Pain purifies the soul and helps you remember. Kind of like an exorcism, but with more textbooks. First off, forget about warnings or detentions. When you messed up, you got a whipping. The teachers would keep a book of discipline, basically a log of how many times each student got punished. It's like a twisted leaderboard of suffering. And if your name was on that list, you were the one they were waiting to humiliate in front of the whole class, and it gets more messed up. But why stop at physical pain when you can inflict emotional scars too? So, yeah, medieval schools weren't all that fun. In fact, they were designed to make you suffer. Now, compare that to today's classrooms and you realize, hey, maybe detention isn't so bad after all. Clean your room, do your homework, don't talk. And we still have those rules today. We just call them behavioral issues and give you Ritalin. The more things change, the more they stay the same, but some things haven't changed. In the old days, they'd make you stand in the corner and be like, But the biggest difference between then and now is opportunity. Today, we still have a long way to go, but at least we've made some progress. The point is, no matter how bad things are, they can always be worse. And if you think your school was strict, just remember, thanks for watching. You survived the first bell, and now it's time for second period. But before we get into that, let me ask you, are you hungry? Well, if you are, that's just too bad because school lunch wasn't a thing back then, which wasn't always the case, especially if you were a girl. Depending on the country and the time period, girls might not be allowed to attend school at all, or they might have to leave after the first grade. This is partly because girls' education wasn't really emphasized in medieval society. They had more important things to learn. That's because water wasn't safe to drink most of the time. If it wasn't contaminated by animal carcasses or human waste, it might be poisoned. So it was best to avoid drinking it altogether. Now, this wouldn't happen in a private household, of course. Wealthy families could afford to hire servants and have their own wells, so they weren't really at risk of getting poisoned. But for most people, the town well was the only option, and those places were absolutely filthy. Wells were usually open to the air and covered with, shall we say, questionable debris. Plus, since the water wasn't treated or purified in any way, it was a prime target for witches looking to curse someone. In fact, poisoning the well was considered one of the most heinous crimes one could commit. The punishment for such an act was, you guessed it, death. But still, people kept doing it. Imagine being the poor schmuck who drank from the poisoned well, then proceeded to fall victim to whatever nasty concoction was in there. Arsenic, lead, maybe some small pebbles to make you choke. No wonder medieval people preferred to suffer from medieval thirst trap, like how to run a household and take care of children. But also, girls helping out at home was just expected. And if that happened during a particularly boring lecture, well, that was just your problem. But if you were hungry and you passed out in class, to learn how you can support us, visit our support page. That was actually good news for everyone involved. At least now you were quiet, and that's all the teacher wanted. It was normal for girls to start helping their mothers with cooking and cleaning duties around the age of 6 or 7, which is around the age children started attending school. And those poor kids who did get to go to school often had to leave early to help their family out. So, yeah, there was no school lunch program, and there was definitely no free lunch for those kids who could and afford it. It was every kid for themselves. And even if it was, you probably couldn't afford it. The food situation in medieval schools was pretty dire, actually. If you wanted to eat, you brought food from home. That is, if your parents let you leave the house to go to school. And what those kids were eating wasn't exactly gourmet, either. Most likely they would bring stale bread, some hard cheese, and maybe if they were feeling fancy, a turnip. Food made students lazy, and that's putting it mildly. See, the whole point of medieval education was rote memorization. Students were basically vessels to be filled with information, and if they weren't paying attention, well, that was their problem. But teachers weren't exactly encouraging them to stay awake. Having a snack during class was completely off limits. Sometimes an apple if it was in season, and that was about it. There was no lunch break. Instead, students ate during pauses between classes if they were allowed to leave the classroom to begin with. Often teachers didn't want students leaving the room. If they were lucky, they might have a few minutes to eat while the teacher was talking about, say, the finer points of herbalism or the correct way to lance a boil. But if the teacher didn't feel like supervising, students would have to eat in their seats. And don't think for a second that they could sneak in a quick snack during class. Not only was food banned in classrooms, but so was water. In fact, students weren't even allowed to drink during their rare breaks outside. If you were unlucky enough to get a teacher who wasn't amused by your suffering, they might kick you out of class. We hope you enjoyed this episode with a special thanks to our supporters. I have a question for you. Where were the girls? Were they in the classroom? Nope. Was education forbidden to them? Yep, but only so they could manage a household, or maybe, just maybe, they could help their fathers with paperwork. But studying in a proper school, now that was a waste of time. Too emotional, too fragile, or unworthy. And why? Yeah, I didn't think that was gonna happen. How about a healer who uses her knowledge of plants and potions to save lives? Nah, too much thinking. What about a leader who uses her intelligence and charisma to unite the kingdom? Please spare us the eye roll. Because thinking too much was bad for you, it made you, well, dangerous. Those were the reasons given for keeping girls out of school, reasons that still make me angry. They say only boys can learn that girls are too emotional to handle books and such a waste of parchment. History shows us that this is false. For centuries, women were denied the right to education. They were told that their brains were unbig enough to handle books or that they'd rather be pretty than smart. And guess what? None of that is true. Girls and women have always been capable of great things. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's rewind back to the Middle Ages. Now go learn something new and do not forget to share it with your friends because the more we know, the more we grow. Well, when it comes to women's rights, I think we can blame those stereotypes. Pay attention. Everyone told me that was the best part of my education. But don't get me wrong, I'm sure these skills are useful, but let me do this instead. What? Oh, no. You won't learn Latin or Greek. You won't study math or astronomy. In fact, you won't learn anything new. Your place is at home, not in school. So you want to be an educated woman? Well, first you'll need some tutors. See, most girls couldn't read or write, let alone study complex subjects. They spent their days at home learning female skills, sewing, cooking, smiling quietly. The idea was to turn them into good little wives and mothers. Not exactly what I would call an education. Because if women were too emotional, too dramatic, and a little too crazy, then people believed that they were also too weak to handle education. If women knew too much, they'd become witches. Now, seriously, do you believe that girls are too emotional to learn? Share your thoughts below. You know how everyone says that the Middle Ages were a time of darkness and superstition? Now, let's head back to the classroom. All right, class is in session. And besides, why waste all that parchment on girls? Or Hildegard von Bingen, who wrote about everything from medicine to music. Don't be silly. They were the exceptions, not the rule. But what about all those famous women scholars like Hypatia of Alexandria, the one who taught Ptolemy? For most girls, their education ended at home. Maybe they learned to read and write. If you were a wealthy, noble girl, you might get some private tutoring, but your lessons would focus on manners, poetry, and maybe some Bible verses. Imagine that you're a girl living in the Middle Ages. You love reading stories about knights and dragons, so you decide to become a knight. You see, it didn't matter what you wanted to do or how much you had to offer. Your gender apparently made you unfit to learn. It's time to rewrite history and remember all the amazing women who came before us. We owe them our right to education. Multiple choice, fill in the blank, true or false, match the following. These are all the kinds of questions you might see on a standardized test, an exam. But these are not the kinds of questions that would have appeared on my exams when I was a kid. And if you mispronounced a phrase, because that was heresy, that was a really bad thing. I remember being called out for mispronouncing the word prophet when I was reading from the Bible, like none. We didn't get graded on our exams. In fact, the only feedback we ever got was our teacher's opinion, and their opinion was almost always the same: we are terrible. Occasionally, one of our teachers would say, "You're not as bad as last time," which we took as a compliment. And if you were really good, like if you had a perfect memory and you never ever messed up, then you got a reward. You got extra Latin, which was kind of like a consolation prize. The other kids would be like, "Oh, I'm so glad I didn't get any extra Latin today." And I'd be like, "Sweet, more Latin, more power to me." But if you weren't good, like if you forgot stuff all the time and you got made fun of a lot, then eventually you got punished. Sometimes the punishment was extra Latin, which was horrible because then you would have to come in early to recite your extra Latin before class started. Other times, the punishment was public shaming, like writing sentences on the blackboard. And the worst punishment, the one that nobody ever wanted, was getting kicked out. And the punishment for this mispronunciation was to stand in the hallway outside the classroom while everyone else went to confession. They weren't about knowledge. They were about obedience and fear. How obedient were you? How scared were you of messing up? Because if you weren't obedient and you weren't terrified, then you wouldn't be able to perform well on an exam. Or as the priest who gave me extra Latin to recite put it, how well do you chant under pressure? Yes, we went to confession every week. In fact, there were no multiple choice questions on any exam I ever took. There was also no scantrons. In other words, there was no objective way to grade our answers. Our exams were public. We stood up in front of the class and recited whatever it was we were supposed to recite. Usually it was Latin. Sometimes it was Greek, which meant that I had to go to confession twice in 1 week. The priest would ask me what my penance was. And the first time I just couldn't remember. I was like, I can't remember what my penance is. And the priest said, you know what your penance is. It's to do better next time. I was like, yeah, that makes sense. So I did, but the second time I forgot my penance again, so the priest just gave me extra Latin to memorize. So there I was standing in the hallway with my extra Latin, waiting for class to end. And then the same thing happened again. The priest asked me what my penance was, and I was like, I can't remember. And he said, you know what your penance is? It's to go home and read the entire Bible. So that was my penance. And the audience for these performances was almost always judgmental. If you were reciting something and you forgot a word, then you were made fun of. Not in a good way. Now, technically, confession is completely optional, but the only times I ever skipped it were the 2 times I forgot my penance, and by the way, there were no grades. So what was the point of these exams? Now we have an abundance of books. It's easy to take this for granted, so let me introduce you to school books. Medieval edition. You're all excited, you've got your wand, you've got your robes, but then you go to class and you see the books. Oh yeah, every single book is chained to the wall, literally. What's up with that? Well, there are 2 answers. The first is price and the second is theft. Let's start with price. These books weren't just chained to the wall, especially if you're a woman, because women were banned from most schools. So if you were a woman who snuck into a boys' school, you might find that all of the school's books had, instead of fairy tales, stories about knights and dragons. That wasn't because medieval authors were a bunch of bigots. It's because they were trying to teach boys how to be good little soldiers. You know, back when they were still debating whether the earth was flat, they didn't exactly have much use for stories about witches and wargs. They were chained to the wall like bikes at a public library. In the meantime, though, the best way to get your hands on a book was to be a rich kid. Okay, class is in session. Pay attention. In other words, they were chained to the wall by the tens and hundreds. And if you want to help us make even more videos about the Middle Ages, please consider supporting us. You can give us money directly, or you could give us something better. You could give us power. Yes, that's right. For a limited time, you can gain the power to influence our videos directly. How does that work? Well, our supporters get to vote on our future topics. That means that you could be the deciding factor between a video about unicorns or a video about the Black Death. So click here to give us some money, or here to influence our videos forever. Thanks for watching. That meant that you wouldn't necessarily be reading the book you wanted to read. It meant that you would be reading whatever book the previous student was reading. In other words, you would be reading whatever book the school happened to have lying around. Imagine it's your first day at Hogwarts. These books weren't cheap. No. They were insanely expensive, more expensive than any textbook today. Hey, can I just steal this book? A teacher might say. There were people who would come in and steal entire shelves of books. Sometimes rival schools would do this, but often it was just people who liked books and wanted to set up their own little library. Look, if you had to chain your textbooks to the wall, you would probably steal them too. Sure, because it would take less time to write out another one than to argue with a thief. That's right, no sir. When it was time to read, students would stand next to a lectern, usually while facing a wall. And instead of paperbacks, they would look at ancient pages made of animal skin, and the ink would be faded from hundreds of hours of monk labor. Can you imagine staring at that for 8 hours a day? No wonder they went blind. In the Middle Ages, it was easier to replace a stolen book than to prosecute a thief. This meant that schools took extreme measures to prevent theft, like chaining the books to walls. At least if you're not going to Harvard. In fact, they were so expensive that schools couldn't afford to buy new ones. They would often get donated or left to the school by a wealthy benefactor who was looking to get some good PR, But regardless of how they acquired these books, schools were very careful about their purchase because they were investments. They were literally priceless. Each book was completely handwritten, often taking months to finish. So if someone strolled in off the street and said, "But don't think that protected them from all book thieves." So chained to the wall they were. And that meant that students couldn't just sit around and read a book like we do today. But wait, it gets worse. And the odds of that book having the exact story you wanted were pretty low. It was only a matter of time before someone invented the printing press. If you want to learn more ways that medieval life was totally different, click here. You know, those old school desks, they weren't built for comfort or convenience. They were designed to maximize the amount of child labor you could extract from a given set of students. The whole room was designed to intimidate. I mean, I got really good grades despite all that. But today's education system is still stuck in medieval mode. Let's go back to ancient Greece. Now, this was an ideal world. It was a world full of philosophy and wonder. You know, when I was a kid, I loved reading. I'd go to the library every week and check out a whole stack of books. But in school, reading was a chore. It was something we did reluctantly and only when we were told to do it. So I guess that explains why so many kids hate reading. Well, turns out there's a reason for that. Turns out our school systems are designed to kill your curiosity. Unfortunately, that world doesn't exist anymore. But we can pretend that it does. And in this world, school is run by Socrates. I am trying to show kids that there's more to the world than what they read being taught in class. I'm trying to re-spark their curiosity. I want them to be in awe again. I want them to look up in the night sky and wonder about the stars and dream about going to other worlds. And maybe one day they'll even get the chance to do that. But first they need to believe in themselves and their own ability to learn. Because most kids are capable of amazing things, but our school system is designed to beat that out of them. He runs his school out of a cave because that's what all the cool schools were doing back then. We're teaching them to memorize things. We're teaching them to obey. And that's why we're falling behind other countries. You have to stop blaming others and start thinking for yourself. And that's what my videos are all about. You know, once upon a time, the United States led the world in science and innovation. But now we're falling behind because other countries are teaching kids to think. And we're teaching kids to obey. And he teaches the next generation of great philosophers. It's pretty chill. And there's no homework. And when the students ask him a question, he doesn't tell them they're being prideful. He actually answers their questions. In fact, that's the only rule of the class. If you have a question, ask it. If you're curious, explore it. That's the Socratic method, and it works pretty well. And after a few years of this, his students are ready to take on the world. It hasn't changed much at all. We still punish kids for going to the bathroom, and we still make them sit at their desks for hours and hours while they listen to someone drone on and on. But back then, they didn't even have the excuse that they needed to study for standardized tests. They just wanted to crush the spirit in you. And the only way to survive was to become invisible. And that's exactly what happened. Most people just sort of became drones. They did everything they were told to do, and they never asked any questions. And that's not what school is supposed to be about. And there was no such thing as a bathroom break. In fact, kids would often be punished for going to the bathroom even when they had permission. Some schools would keep a tally of how many times a student went to the bathroom. And if they went too many times, they'd have to do extra work. And if they didn't go at all, well, they'd get detention for holding it. Now, I don't want to complain. So let me take you back to another time and another place where school wasn't a punishment and learning was a joy. But that's not what happens in real school. You see, school is supposed to be about learning, but instead it's become about obedience. And that's what my videos are trying to change. You know, it's funny, they used to say that education was the key to the future, but now we're teaching kids to regurgitate facts. Well, if you want to change the world, then you have to start by changing yourself. You have to reclaim your curiosity. Here at our school, we're pretty proud of our alumni. Well, most of them. Here are just a few of our distinguished former students, no caps and gowns. If you graduated, it meant your monk teacher decided you weren't hopeless. Some students moved on to cathedral schools or universities, which were just as miserable but had more soup. Others became monks, scribes, or priests. And many dropped out, scarred for life, and returned to farming. There were no alumni reunions. Typically, we ask for 10 lashes with a cat o' nine tails or the equivalent in labor. Hours are flexible. We understand that running a farm or a village or a small business can be demanding, so we've structured our classes around your busy schedule, including dormitories and private rooms. Dormitories are spacious, well ventilated, and come with your very own bed made of human bones. Private rooms are also available for an additional donation: 2 goats, a cow, or the firstborn of your firstborn, depending on the room. All rooms are ensuite with views of the courtyard where you'll be hanged if you break the rules. Simply show up at the scriptorium between the hours of 6 a.m. and 10 p.m. 7 nights a week, and we'll work around your availability. No proud parents. Which means that if you get murdered, we'll probably notice. We believe that learning is a collaborative process, which is why we encourage our students to beat each other over the head with wooden mallets whenever they feel inspired. We also offer a variety of extracurricular activities, including hunting, arson, and for the artistically inclined, illuminations, which is when you color those pictures that the crazy monks make. Just the knowledge that you survived years of cold, hunger, Latin, and psychological warfare. Okay. Stop ruining your life and start ruining everyone else's at our open house on Saturday. Come see our beautiful campus, meet our dedicated faculty and staff, and watch our students pull a fully intact medieval village out of a hat. It's gonna be great. Fun for the whole family, unless your family sucks. You made it through the worst school system ever invented. If you're not already sold, please refer to our extensive list of reasons you should send your kid here so he can die. See you on Saturday. Welcome to my school. Founded in the year 480 by Saint Benedict, our school boasts over 1,500 years of educational excellence. We specialize in turning promising young boys into God-fearing men who can barely read. Our curriculum is second to none. Most of them. After graduation, some go on to be scholars and writers, while others become monks or priests. A select few even go on to head the church, provided that head isn't made of cheese. And we're very proud of our school in shaping these young men into the leaders of tomorrow, or at least the leaders of one day, because most of them died of the plague. In fact, during the Middle Ages, we were the second best school in Europe, right after the Cathedral School of Paris, and that's only because they had the bodies of saints in their courtyard that inspired awe and reverence in all who entered. Sleep tight. Actually, there were no diplomas. Congratulations, most of them. Now we accept students from all walks of life, provided that walk of life is within walking distance of a monastery. We have a zero-tolerance policy for cheating, sloth, heresy, and bringing your pet lizard into the scriptorium. Our dropout rate is low, thanks to our incredibly thorough vetting process, which includes locking the doors. Our teaching methods are innovative, some of them. Our facilities are top-notch. Okay, well, except for the sewage, the rats, the lack of heating, and the fact that the walls are perpetually stained with the blood of small animals. But you know, every school has its quirks. Oh, hello, our teachers are the best. We've been educating Europe's elite since the Dark Ages. Well, actually since the early Middle Ages, our alumni are doing great things. Tuition is free, but donations are always welcome. Our student-teacher ratio is small. We offer a range of housing options. Are you ready to join our esteemed institution? Thank you for your interest in our school.